We're looking at a conflict that literally shattered the modern world, World War I. Now, I know it can sometimes feel like an overwhelming blur of dates and just unimaginable tragedy, but today we're going to break down this historical earthquake step by step, almost like a documentary. We're going to trace the exact events that triggered this great avalanche so we can truly understand its world-altering consequences.
Okay, let's dive into this. The spark that ignited a global firestorm operated on a terrifyingly tight timeline. It all begins on June 28, 1914, in the city of Sarajevo. A 19-year-old nationalist named Gavrilo Princip assassinates Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. And just weeks later, Austro-Hungary sends this really humiliating ultimatum to Serbia. When Serbia rejects it, watch how fast the dominoes fall. Within hours, Austro-Hungarian forces are shelling the Serbian capital of Belgrade. Within days, Tsar Nicholas II of Russia mobilizes his massive army to defend Serbia, a fellow Slav nation. And because German Emperor Wilhelm II had promised support to Austro-Hungary, German mobilization immediately follows. Just like that, the avalanche is in motion, and there's no stopping it.
Now, you might be wondering, how does a localized Balkan conflict drag in the entire world? Well, look at the great powers of Europe at the time. They were divided into two heavily armed rival camps, the Triple Entente of France, Britain, and Russia, and the Triple Alliance of Germany, Austro-Hungary, and Italy. Officially, these alliances were supposed to be defensive, but in reality, they were locked together by deep fear and suspicion. Germany was terrified of being encircled by its rivals, and Austro-Hungary was just desperately clinging to a fragile empire. When that spark in Sarajevo ignited, these massive interlocking treaties basically guaranteed that the whole continent would be pulled right into the blaze.
Let's break down how this actually translates into military action. Germany knew that a war with Russia meant a war with Russia's ally, France. So to avoid fighting a devastating war on two fronts at the same time, they relied on a highly specific military calculus called the Schlieffen Plan. Step 1. Advance rapidly through neutral Belgium. Step 2. Encircle and destroy the French armies near Paris for a quick, decisive victory. Step 3. Pivot all those forces east to deal with the massive Russian army, which they figured would take much longer to mobilize. But here's the thing. This massive gamble required violating Belgian neutrality, and that specific move is what ultimately forced Britain's hand to join the fight against Germany. The sheer dizzying speed of these initial clashes is wild. In week 1, Germany formally declares war on Russia and France. By week 2, as German troops invade Belgium, Britain enters the war. Now, historical sources note that during this initial invasion, German troops committed massacres against Belgian civilians. These atrocities were heavily inflated by Allied propaganda, but it absolutely succeeded in turning neutral public opinion firmly against Germany. By week 4, the Russian army blunders into a massive disaster at the Battle of Tannenberg, losing 90,000 prisoners to the Germans. But then, by week 6, at the First Battle of the Marne, a desperate French and British counterattack halts the German advance just 40 miles outside of Paris. Actually, in a totally desperate move, French troops were literally ferried to the front line using fleets of Parisian city taxicabs. It saved the city, but it cost 250,000 casualties on both sides. But following the Marne, that fast-paced war of movement ground to a horrifying halt. I really want you to picture the claustrophobic reality for these soldiers. The armies engaged in what was called a race to the sea, trying to outflank each other, until there was simply nowhere left to run. Soldiers dug in along an unbroken 350-mile front stretching all the way from the English Channel down to the Swiss border. This is trench warfare. It was a bloody, unimaginable stalemate where millions of men sought shelter in the mud from the deadly, sweeping fire of machine guns and just relentless artillery shells. And because they were stuck in that stalemate, it accelerated a terrifying technological arms race. The battlefield transformed into a completely industrialized killing zone. We see the deployment of German U-boats, these submarine predators sinking ships from beneath the waves. We see the sheer horror of lethal chlorine gas choking men right in their trenches. Giant Zeppelins enact the world's first strategic bombing campaigns over Britain. Up in the air, new interrupter gear allows airplanes to fire machine guns right through their propellers, giving us the first true fighter planes. And eventually, armored tanks rumble onto the battlefield just to crush the barbed wire. Humanity had permanently escalated how it wages war. Now, we have to remember, this wasn't just a European war. It was a truly global tragedy. The conflict spread across the oceans, down into the colonial territories of Africa, throughout the Middle East, and all the way over to Asia. Battles raged everywhere from modern-day Kenya and Namibia to the port of Basra and the coast of Chile. And tragically, this massive global scale brought immense suffering to civilians. Our source highlights a deeply sobering event during this spread. The Ottoman Empire began the systematic deportation and murder of ethnic Armenians. Over 1 million Armenians perished. The Allies condemned this as a crime against humanity, while the Turkish government to this day disputes the death toll and the classification of these events as genocide. But the reach and the human cost of this conflict were absolutely boundless.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the terrifying shift in military strategy we see by 1916. The hope for a quick, glorious victory, that was completely dead. Instead, generals on both sides embraced a war of attrition. This is a strategy that doesn't focus on capturing territory or outmaneuvering the opponent. Instead, the sole focus is on grinding down the enemy, inflicting such unimaginable losses that their society and their military are simply forced to collapse and surrender.
And nothing captures this grim strategy quite like the chilling exact words of German General Erich von Falkenhayn. His mandate? Bleed France white. He specifically chose the historic, deeply symbolic French fortress town of Verdun for a massive assault because he knew France would defend it to the very last man. The goal wasn't just to capture Verdun. The goal was to create a mincing machine that would literally destroy French infantry divisions as fast as they could be fed into the trenches.
And this is the result of that horrific calculus. 365,000. That is the staggering number of casualties suffered by the French army alone in the absolute hellscape of Verdun. The Germans lost almost as many men in the exact same battle. The French commander, General Naval, promised they shall not pass. And the French did hold the line. But Verdun remains one of the bloodiest, most terrifyingly senseless battles in all of human history.
And the horror definitely wasn't confined to Verdun. To relieve the pressure on the French, the British and French launched a massive summer offensive at the River Somme. Just look at this number, 57,000 casualties. Imagine an entire modern city's population just struck down in a matter of hours. That was the toll for the British Army on just the very first day of the Battle of the Somme. A massive artillery bombardment totally failed to destroy the German defenses, and waves of British infantry were mercilessly cut down by machine gun fire as they walked out into no man's land. It still remains the worst single day in the history of the British Army.
As we follow the timeline here, we hit the crucial pivot of 1917, where massive external forces finally start to break the deadlock. In February, Germany is so desperate to starve Britain out that they gamble by resuming unrestricted submarine warfare, sinking neutral ships. Then in March, British intelligence intercepts the Zimmermann telegram, revealing that Germany is actually encouraging Mexico to attack the United States. Also in March, bread shortages and massive casualties trigger a revolution in Russia, leading to the Tsar's abdication. Finally, totally outraged by the U-boats and the telegram, the United States officially declares war on Germany in April, bringing vast, fresh resources to the Allied cause. Suddenly, it becomes a desperate race against time.
But before those American troops could actually arrive in force, 1917 pushed both sides to the absolute brink of societal and military collapse. On the Allied side, the exhaustion was total. Senseless losses caused entire French units to just straight up mutiny. The Russian army effectively collapsed as the Bolsheviks took power and sought peace. The Italian front was smashed, forcing massive retreats. But over on the German side, the desperation was just as severe. The British naval blockade was causing outright starvation among German civilians, and those endless casualties were draining their manpower reserves completely dry. Which brings us to the final, frantic chapter, the final gamble of 1918. Freed from a two-front war because Russia had signed a peace treaty, German General Ludendorff launched a massive spring offensive using fresh troops and new infiltration tactics. They pushed deep into Allied territory, but by the summer, nearly 1 million fresh American soldiers had arrived in France to reinforce the exhausted Allies. On August 8th, coordinated Allied counterattacks supported by tanks and aircraft smashed the German lines so decisively that Ludendorff himself called it the Black Day of the German army. This sparked the relentless 100 Days Offensive, pushing the exhausted German army into a full retreat. And as those German lines buckled on the Western Front, we see this rapid domino effect take hold across all the Central Powers. An overstretched Bulgaria is the first to fold, signing an armistice. British-led forces completely defeat the Ottomans at Megiddo, leading to their surrender. At the Battle of Vittorio Veneto, the Austro-Hungarian army just disintegrates. Finally, the German High Seas Fleet is ordered on a suicidal attack, but the sailors outright mutiny. Revolution sweeps through Germany, forcing the Kaiser to abdicate and a German republic to be proclaimed. And then
the moment the world had been bleeding for. At 11 a.m. on November 11th, 1918, inside a railway carriage at Compiègne, an armistice comes into force. The guns finally fall silent. Tragically, though, the fighting continued right up until the very last possible moment. American Private Henry Gunther was killed charging a German machine gun at 10:59 a.m., literally just 1 minute before peace. He's thought to be the final soldier killed in the Great War.
So the crucial point is what happened next. Because honestly, the peace was almost as destructive as the war itself. The delegates met at the Paris Peace Conference to draft the Treaty of Versailles, and the terms imposed on Germany were uncompromisingly harsh. Their military was severely restricted in size. They were forced to pay massive, crippling war reparations to the Allies. All of their colonial territories were seized, and perhaps most significantly of all, Germany was forced to accept full responsibility for the conflict in a devastating war guilt clause. This became a source of deep, lasting resentment in Germany. I mean, just look at how the very map of the world was violently rewritten from the ashes of the old world. Century-old empires simply vanished. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and the Russian Empire, gone. In their place, this whole patchwork of new nations was drawn onto the map. Poland re-emerged after 100 years. Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia were born. But in redrawing these borders, especially in Europe and the Middle East, the victorious powers carelessly sowed the seeds for intense regional conflicts that literally still dominate our daily news feeds today. Before we finish up, we really have to look at the true cost of this avalanche. 9.5 million. That is the staggeringly solemn number of soldiers who lost their lives in the trenches, the seas, and the skies. 1 in every 8 men who fought did not return. Another 21 million were wounded, carrying the physical and psychological scars of industrialized warfare for the rest of their lives. And right behind that military toll is this absolutely devastating figure: 7 million. 7 million civilians lost their lives to starvation, disease, bombardment, and massacres. The human consequence of this conflict is almost too vast to fully comprehend. Entire generations were just wiped out, and huge areas of Europe were left completely devastated. Which leaves us with a haunting question to reflect on. We've traced this avalanche from a single spark, all the way to the absolute redrawing of the global map. But looking at the millions dead, the new borders, and the bitter resentment fueled by that war guilt clause, we have to ask ourselves, did the harsh terms of Versailles truly end the war to end all wars? Or did it merely plant the seeds for an even darker chapter? Thank you so much for walking through this explainer with me. Keep asking questions